Hi, it's me again. So someone knocked on my door. So this is part two of the new criticism lecture, and I hope that won't happen again because now I've put a note on the outside of the door uh, telling people not to knock. So we shall see. We shall see. Where I left off was we were just talking about how we should be skeptical that the voice that speaks outside of a poem is actually, you know, 100% authentic in terms of what the author might have meant anyway. Because we are often people who like to represent ourselves as slightly different than how we might actually feel. Think about the last time you were at a party. Did you always say 100% truthful things to people? Like if you're asked how much you liked the hummus dip, did you? Did you really like the hummus dip as much as you said you did? Probably not, right? So anyway, the same thing goes for a poem. Whatever, to whatever extent, it's an analogous thing. All right. In other words, we can think about the image that an author might try to depict of him or herself as being a better person than he or she might actually be in real life, someone who is very complimentary of hummus dips. But we have no way of knowing whether that image actually matches their personality. And it would be foolish to assume, I think, that we know a poet really well simply because we've read their poetry a lot. What we actually know really well is their poetry, right? And it's a different thing. The new critics suggest that in the end it's not really that interesting to know about authors as much as to investigate what they wrote. Because after all, that's what we're able to make arguments about once we've trained ourselves to use the evidence very well. But because there's no way of actually knowing the true self of anybody from the things that they produce, not only is it not really worth trying to bang your head against that wall continuously, but it's not really as interesting as the reason that we wanted to know them in the first place. It's natural to want to know more about an author. It's natural, but you're not going to be able to do it. The other trend that this is based on is what's called a linguistic turn, and that is the growing historical awareness in modern times that language structures the way we think in such a fundamental way that we are often more in its power than we can ever actually control language ourselves. There's this thing called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in child development psychology that says you actually have to have a word before you can have a thought. In other words, that some ideas are so completely dependent on having the language for them that it is pointless to try to think about how one might communicate what words don't exist for. Right? And that is a really it's an old hypothesis, but it really does underscore exactly how strongly the new critics associated language and thought. And so since language comes from outside us, it's all about how we're using pre-made words in order to express ourselves rather than inventing new words in order to invent new ideas, which may be impossible. You can put the old words together in new ways, of course. I'm not suggesting the contrary to that, but it is worth thinking about the linguistic turn when we consider whether or not it would even be possible for an author to have complete control over a text, even though they might think they do. Language existed before we did, and it changes and adapts to events in an often alarmingly fast-paced manner that can leave us playing catch-up at best. I mean catch up, not catch up. Since it is external to us, even when we put our own thoughts into language, other people can be just as much of an authority on what those words mean when strung together. We can't avoid being influenced by other people's words. And what we said 10 years ago may seem hopelessly outdated to us when we hear them again in the present. I know that's certainly true when I read some of the stuff that I've published a while back. I think it's still good, and I'm glad I wrote it, but it's not really me anymore. But that goes back to what I've been saying throughout this little lecture. More to the point, the words inside a text may create resonances and nuances of language that have more to do with the words themselves than with the stamp of meaning an author tries to imprint upon those words, which again may be impossible. So what you want to do is you want to avoid the intentional fallacy by speaking about what the text does or what the poem does, rather than what the author thought, because you can't know that. So you want to say the speaker of a poem rather than assuming that the voice that speaks to you is somehow identical with the author. So it's the speaker of Emily Dickinson's Wild Nights rather than Dickinson herself, whom you may feel uncomfortable associating with such erotic feelings anyway. I like to think of her as someone who did, but I can't know for sure. I think maybe she was just experimenting. So you say speaker if you're talking about the voice within a poem. You say the narrator if you're talking about a novel, rather than the poet or the novelist's name. Right? If you find the concept of the text's author helpful, you can use it, but just say the author of this poem or the author of this novel, right? Rather than automatically conflating those things. And maybe this seems like a small point, but it's a really big one, and it certainly meant a lot to Oscar Wilde. So it makes a difference if you follow this advice. And then never assume that a work published earlier in an author's career should be treated equivalently with one published later in their career. In the same way that it would be, I think, misguided without context to assume that stuff that's published later in their career represents progress or growth, because there are just as many examples of authors who kind of like fall off in their craft later in their career as those that build up, right? I mean, it happens obviously, but it's not something that you can automatically assume that just because somebody was older that they were therefore wiser. Sometimes it happens the other way. Treat the process of artistic creation as a complex and dynamic enterprise, but don't reveal the result unduly. Be skeptical about any author's statements to the effect of "this is what I meant," because they are out there on the internet, and just because it's on the internet doesn't mean that it's true. But having said that, right, I hope that you're hearing this in a way that will equip you to be able to make really great arguments about literary texts, rather than to make you feel like, well, there's too much to know to be able to say anything confidently. No, being able to take a poem in isolation and read it well means that you have just as much authority to say these things as the author of the text, right? And whether or not you believe that right away or you need a little bit of practice with it before you will, that's fine. But it does mean that I will listen very carefully to what you have to say, because you're probably right in ways that I'm not, and so forth. And we all can learn from each other as well as we form our learning community. So that's the first big fallacy that the new criticism helps us to avoid, the intentional fallacy. There's another one, though, called the affective fallacy, and this is affect with an A. This fallacy, involves the reader's inability to divorce her or his personal reactions to the text from the affect that the text actually produces. So, let's say, this is an absurd example, but let's say my dear Aunt Mabel, whom I don't have, particularly loved oversized fake baubles and jewelry, which, though eccentric, merely underscored what I loved about the spectacular lady. Then I read a short story in which a scurrilous jewel thief steals a diamond and replaces it with a fake. But I am unable to muster any sympathy for the hapless victims of this crime, because all I can think about is Aunt Mabel and how she would have been just fine in this situation. This is a problem, and it's absurd and obvious, right? But I mean, there will be analogs too for other reactions that you might have, and what you need to do is to make sure that the reaction that you're having is actually sponsored by the text, rather than something that you are importing willy-nilly and may lead to a bad reading. Right? So if I can't think, let's say I can't think of anything except through the lens of Aunt Mabel, I'm going to be a really bad reader of poetry, because there's bound to be stuff that I read about that won't have anything to do with my aunt. Anyway, again, it's a ludicrous example, but there will be analogs, and I'm going to talk about those right now. Of course, our individual reading practices are probably not as obvious to ourselves as they may be to others. So that is another reason why we should have this learning community, to read things within a class or a book group later on in life, rather than assuming that you can read a text and always have an objective, and always to achieve the ideal of objective reading. I may advise you to make the meaning you read in a text dependent on the situation and the invoked context that the work wants you to think about, which sometimes is other poems, sometimes it's historical trends or the time period that within which the text was written. But it may not be easy to carry out this advice without some method for differentiating your personal reasons for feeling certain emotions from the interpretation you create from reading emotionally, right? I'm also not saying get rid of all emotion from yourself, because then you'd be some sort of robot, and no one wants that. But it is true that you want to make sure that the emotional response that you're having is due to the text that you're reading, rather than something which may be quite unrelated to what you're doing. You have an argument, with your partner early on in the day, you read a text belligerently or angrily. Later on, you might cool off, go back, reread the same passage, have a completely different interpretation. This is something we need to guard against, and you get better at it with time. The new critics suggest a method called the objective correlative, and this is a process of working backward from an instance in the text where you had a strong emotion in order to figure out whether you've had the appropriate response. The name of the term kind of reflects and suggests how it works. Objective is something or some place that you can point to in a text. You have to be able to find it within the pages, right? Rather than something that you infer or something else outside the text that it made you think of, right? Which, again, are not part of it. And then correlative is something or some place that creates a response in you that you feel sure would correlate to other readers' responses. So that, just to go back to the sort of communal nature of meaning, when you're talking about things that are functions of language, right? You would have to suggest to yourself that someone else would be able to read that same, would look at that same part that you're pointing to with your finger, right? And feel the same thing, right? Or at least not say, I don't feel that and I don't think I should have, right? For example, in most of the second half of Ernest Hemingway's novel A Farewell to Arms, which is about World War I, it's raining. When it rains a great deal, or for a prolonged period of time, for days, weeks, a month, I tend to get moody and dour in my outlook on life. Is this evidence, you might ask? I can point to the rain, right? It's in the novel. It is raining. Would every possible reader have noticed this rain and had an emotional response to it? Should I interpret the novel as being gloomy and dark based only on the fact that it's raining? No, I shouldn't, right? Not solely based on my personal hatred of rain. That is not evidence. And even the likelihood that others might also be depressed by some sort of watery deluge wouldn't necessarily work as evidence unless I can tie it to other facts within the text that then create a pattern, right? The pattern is the correlative. The protagonist is fighting on the Italian front in World War I. It's not going well. He feels his life is out of control. His personal stoicism doesn't seem to keep him from becoming overwhelmed by his emotions. He's probably shell-shocked. So check. Yes, I should feel gloomy because of those other things, which the rain symbolizes, right? But it's only because of that context that I feel confident saying that the rain is symbolic of the protagonist's problems. It's harder to assess those instances where we can use our sympathetic reactions to judge a situation. We want to make sure that the standards we have used to judge it match those which may be sponsored by the text. And those standards are not always easy to find or to describe concretely. Certainly the answer is never to stop reading while being attentive to your feelings. Please be an emotional individual. But our emotional responses, especially if the text comes from a historical period that's remote from ours, or a culture which is different from the one that we live within, it can be difficult to match what our emotions are telling us from what we feel like those contemporary readers or readers within the culture that it was produced would also feel. So, for example, there's a novel called Pamela by Samuel Richardson. It was one of the first novels. It was published in 1740. The title character is a serving girl in a wealthy squire's mansion. She gets kidnapped by her would-be benefactor, Mr. B, just one letter, who repeatedly tries to rape her. Clearly, we are meant to sympathize with her. She's the victim, right? But by the end of the novel, Pamela agrees to marry Mr. B, who has reformed, in quotes, to the extent that any rapist can be reformed. And even though our senses are screaming at us, this is a terrible thing for her to do. She's in great danger. She should not do this. The novel itself clearly makes the case that this is a good social climb in England, which after all is pretty class conscious, right? And she is of a far lower class than Mr. B is, so this is like the best thing that could happen to her in terms of class. And after all, Mr. B does have the angelic Pamela urging him to do good, and so it's not as though, that the reformation that he's experienced won't be encouraged. She'll be there with him, and if it worked once, then maybe it'll happen again and again. It's just an instance where the past is a different country, right? And it can be really difficult for students that I've led through Pamela, to reconcile themselves with this horrible, horrible decision. But here is a contrary example that proves the peril of presuming that the past is always another country. There's a book called Heart of Darkness, which many of you probably read in high school. It's by Joseph Conrad. It was written in 1899. The narrator of this, it's a novella. The narrator is named Marlowe. He makes frequent use of the N-word to describe the African inhabitants of the jungles of Congo, around the Congo River in Middle Africa. It may be tempting to assume that by the late 19th century, that term was commonplace rather than the hurtful racist epithet that we know it as today, right? And that therefore we ought to ignore our own emotional responses of revulsion against any narrator who would use that term, right? Because it was the past, and maybe things were different then. But no, if you dig a little bit further, it's clear that Marlowe's a racist, for one thing. Chinua Achebe, who wrote Things Fall Apart, has a really influential essay that explains exactly how Heart of Darkness is an extremely racist book, even though it seems to have anti-imperialist and anti-colonial aims. And so some of it is good, obviously, but still extremely troubling in terms of its racism. But even in terms of like the book's publication, there's an 1895 novel by Conrad called the N-word of the Narcissus. 1895, so this is 4 years before Heart of Darkness. When it was sold in the United States, it had to be renamed Children of the Sea in order to be sensitive to the American context. Conrad must have known that before 1899. He didn't care. So we should judge the use of the N-word as an example of Marlowe's racism, and I suppose by proxy you could make the claim that it's Conrad, but again, don't automatically assume that Marlowe and Conrad believe all the same things together. Even in a book that is seemingly dedicated to showing how bad the imperial project of whites controlling blacks in Africa could get. Okay? So you want to try to avoid the affective fallacy by pinpointing places in the text where you had an emotional response and then checking to make sure that that response was sponsored by the text. You want to judge actions and characters by using the evidence presented by the text, sometimes when checked in against language that the language that existed at the time of the text creation. Which again can get a little tricky, and you should expect that I will always give you that information when I want you to be questioning it in that sense. But you can do me a favor by making sure that your emotional responses, are matched up with what you assume the text wanted you to feel, right? And again, the text rather than the author. So those are the two main supporting struts of the new criticism. And as I say, if you just imagine yourself reading some of the poems for this unit, with the author's names and the title of the poem kind of clipped off, that's one way of going about having a text stand in isolation. And certainly I haven't given you a lot of biographical or historical context. To my mind, of course, historical context is going to make more of a difference than the author anyway, after what I've just said. But this is a good exercise if you are somebody who is always associating like a film with its director. Which, by the way, is even more fraught than assuming that the voice within a poem is spoken by the poet, because films are these really big, joint products of producers and associate producers, and like the script writer and the actors themselves bring a lot to the film too. A director has a lot of control over a film, but not total control. So it's kind of like a corporate authorship. A poem is certainly, except in extremely rare cases where you've got, like, say, John Lennon and Paul McCartney writing a song together or something like that. Addison and Steele, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound wrote a few things together. But most of the time, it's just one person writing a relatively short text. But even there, or perhaps especially there, we want to make sure that we are distinguishing between the text and the author, the persona that speaks to us from the poem, rather than the author picking up a telephone and talking to us. As if we were just having a conversation, because these are complex things. How complex? Well, we'll start talking more about that on Thursday. But this is enough to get you to be thinking about how you could identify the distinguishing character traits of any voice that's speaking to you from out of a poem, and that'll be what the Twitter prompt on Wednesday will get you to start thinking about in terms of one of the poems for this week. So please do take a look at all of those. I think they're either 11 or 12 for week 1 of the module. All of them are short. And if you read those before Wednesday, then you'll have a chance to actually respond using evidence, which is what we want. All right? Good day to you. And have fun reading through Module 2 and the instructions for the wiki assignment. Thank you.